who was a close friend of Susan's. She's going to testify to many different things in this case. One of the things that she's going to discuss is this issue.
Loyalty was everything to Susan. She learned it from her father. It was the mafioso way. If you had a friend who took care of you, you took care of them for life. She was extremely loyal to a number of lifelong people for life in a lifelong way.
Now, this is going to be repeated by many other witnesses, including another friend of Susan's, Kim Langford.
I would say that Susan would do anything to help her close friends.
No matter the situation.
No matter the situation. Mm-hmm. She was loyal. I think she was a loyal soul to the end. Definitely.
Now, Bob Durst himself commented during the 2010 interviews with the filmmakers regarding the closeness of his relationship with Susan and kind of what bonded them together.
We would spend a lot of time together. We could talk. We had the thing in common. Both of her parents died when she was young. And I had one parent die when I was young. She was raised by various sleepaway school, high school, prep schools, private high schools, and she was raised by them. I was raised by governesses. Neither of us got a chance to meet our parents hardly at all.
Linda Opes will further testify to that dynamic as she observed it of Susan and the defendant's relationship.
So something happened when she met Bobby Durst. It was like, here's a man as powerful as my father, as connected. It's even funny that the word is connected. Do you know? As connected, as powerful, and he needs me.
Now, there is a tendency sometimes in murder cases for victims to become angelic when they're killed. And in essence, you are who you are. Everybody has their flaws and everybody is who they are. And Susan, who was a victim of murder in this case, could be very, very manipulative. You're going to hear from her close friend, Steven Silverman. And he's going to discuss and he's going to testify as to how Susan kind of softly manipulated those she wanted things from.
Was Susan a manipulative person?
Extremely.
And can you explain why you gave that answer?
If one way or another, Susan would get whatever it was she wanted. You know, if she might start out politely, but then she would really start threatening you or telling you, I did this for you, I did that for you.
And is this
Susan, never took no for an answer.
Whoops.
In your experience, is Susan the kind of person who, in your experience, would overtly blackmail a friend? Overtly.
You know, Susan was too clever to do anything overtly.
And can you tell me what you mean by that?
She would find other ways. She would hint that she had something on you. She pulled that on me.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Linda Opes will testify and she will provide a little more detail as to how she had observed Susan manipulate those around her.
Was Susan a manipulative person?
Excuse me?
Was Susan manipulative?
Somewhat, yes.
And can you explain how she was manipulative?
She was emotionally manipulative.
Have you ever used the term that she charm manipulated?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
If you were a person that she deemed necessary in her life, emotionally or financially or career-wise necessary in her life, she could be unbelievably charming to keep you there. she was brilliantly charming with our head of production, Tom Mount. She was brilliantly charming with me when she needed me to never fire her from the screenplay and move it on when I realized it had no future.
Based on your experience, was Susan someone who could use her manipulative skills to get money?
Yes, I think this was most of her charm, except for love, was in order to survive. She was always in survivalist mode.
And this kind of brings us back to really the beginning of the story and the beginning of what happened involving Bob Durst, and the three people that were going to present evidence were victims of homicide by him. It all goes back to his relationship with Kathie Durst. And so in order to understand that relationship, and in order to understand what led up to Mr. Durst killing her, getting rid of her body, we have to go back to the beginning, and that starts with who's Kathie Durst. So in the fall of 1971, when Bob Durst was 29 years old, he met Kathie McCormack. Kathie was 19 years old. Kathie grew up in Long Island, somewhat lower middle class. She came from a very big Irish Catholic family. She was the youngest, and she was, without question, the star of the family. She was the prettiest, she was the smartest, she was kind of the hope for everybody. She was also the baby. Now, during his 2011 interview, Bob Durst discussed the beginnings of the relationship. And he was asked by Andrew Jarecki, he was basically asked to kind of explain, what had happened. And kind of set up and explained, okay, here's how our relationship started.
So let's talk about what you were doing when you met Kathie. Were you living in Vermont? Were you living in the city? How did you do it?
When I met Kathie, I was still living, it was still 1970. I'd come home from UCLA, staying in Katona, trying to decide what I was going to do. Came up with the health food store idea. I was living in Katona in Westchester. And I told her the idea. Well, I guess we drove up there. And I showed her where I thought I was looking to lease the store, and she loved Middlebury, thought it was just beautiful. She loved the idea. And I guess at some point around that, I said, I'm with you. I'd like you to live with me. I'd like you to move to Middlebury, Vermont, which would mean she'd stop being whatever she was. She had a job, a dental hygienist. I guess she'd gone to Adelphi for a year or so and dropped out. But it meant that she was going to, change her life and come see me. And Jimmy came up and visited me twice. And I was nice to him way back then. I wasn't treating him badly like I gradually started doing.
Where did you first meet her?
I first met Kathie at a party that my friend Stuart Altman took her to.
And then how did it come to pass that she ended up living in a Durst building?
Well, she was already, Stuart must have knew somebody else in the family. I don't remember who. And Stuart met Kathie and her friend, whatever her friend's name was. They had both just gotten jobs as dental hygienists and needed a place to stay. And Stuart said, well, I know this guy, and his family owns a whole bunch of buildings. And Stuart called somebody. Actually, it wasn't one of the Dursts. It was one of the people who worked there Stuart had met. He called them up and said, I have two nice chick ladies, and they're looking for an apartment. Kathie was given a phone number to call, or her roommate was, and they called whoever was leasing the tenements, and Kathie rented an apartment.
when you first met her, I guess at the party, what was your first reaction to her?
Pretty.
Was she your type? Had you had a type? Did you have?
No, I never had a type. We spoke for a good while, nice conversationalists. Planned on going out, in several days, and did that.
So you were older than she was at that time.
9 years.
And was there any stigma attached to that at the time, or was that fairly common?
9 years is a long time.
Age difference-wise.
Yes, 9 years is an old time. I had oodles of education. She had zilch. Girl from a small town without, no big deal. I mean, for me, I guess you would say I was marrying beneath me or something like that, or she was marrying up or well or something like that. But I never got there. I mean, money didn't mean anything to me, and it didn't make any difference to me where she was from.
Durst also discussed the 9-year age difference between he and Kathie, because remember, he was 31 at the time they met, and she was just 19.
And was there any stigma attached to that at the time, or was that fairly common?
9 years is a long time.
Age difference-wise.
Yes, 9 years is an old time. I had oodles of education. She had zilch. Girl from a small town without, no big deal. I mean, for me, I guess you would say I was marrying beneath me or something like that, or she was marrying up or well or something like that. But I never got there. I mean, money didn't mean anything to me, and it didn't make any difference to me where she was from.
Every once in a while, by the way, because of all the editing that's involved, I don't think it happens a lot, but I noticed that there was an overlap on that clip with the last clip, so I don't think it's going to happen very often, but my apologies for that one. It was Mr. No, that was on me, so I apologize. On April 12th, I'm sorry. So Bob Durst also talked about the experience with Kathie's family and what it was like meeting them and how he interacted with them.
So these experiences with her family were kind of like Bob meets the average American family.
Well, more than meet, Bob is forced to spend time with the average American family. Bob is supposed to be polite and cooperative and pleasant and engage in the same conversations that they are, and I just couldn't do that. I just kept feeling like I should show them that I despise these things that they do.
And
Ridicule these things that they do.
do you remember ridiculing in front of them?
Well, talking about my penis in front of Kathie's mother, that was about as extreme as I could imagine.
Yeah.
On April 12th, 1973, which was the defendant's birthday, he and Kathie were married. In October of that same year, they moved back to New York City. Now, at the time, Durst was working at the family-run Durst organization while Kathie attended nursing school in Connecticut. There are quotation marks around work because Mr. Durst is going to describe what he actually did there and what his work day was. And when you listen to him, he's brutally honest about it. He doesn't in any way make it sound like he was working.
I would show up for a meeting with 15 guys 2 hours late, stoned, wearing a t-shirt and a jock or whatever, and let everybody know that the way to waste a life is to sit around a big table and talk about gibberish documents all day long. And I was there infrequently. I'd never go in the morning. For an early, arrival for me would be after lunch.
Now, the evidence is going to show, by the way, when you see these headphones,
Please make a note that I'd like to speak to the court also after we recess on character. And
All right, is that an objection? Is that an objection or is it not?
yes, it is.
All right.
I assume I can continue on.
It's just a moment. Don't conclude from any evidence that the defendant is disposed to commit crime.
Thank you. When you see, it's a little bit confusing, when you see this image, which is Bob Durst with headphones on, and seated next to him is Andrew Jarecki, you're going to hear evidence that the first time that Mr. Durst spoke to Andrew Jarecki was on December 11th, 2010. And he did that, the first thing they did was, they basically watched the movie, All Good Things, which we'll get to. And while they're watching the movie, Mr. Durst is commenting on what he is saying. So when you see the image of him with headphones, which you're seeing now, that is from the DVD commentary. And that's what we refer to it as. So that's basically the interview, and it's the first interview that took place. The evidence about Mr. Durst and his views about work or his views about entitlement have nothing to do with in any way arguing that because Mr. Durst had that viewpoint, he committed crimes or was in any way predisposed. The evidence will be brought to you and will be demonstrated to show that, in essence, Mr. Durst, in the way that he lived his life, from how he worked to how he committed crimes to how he covered up those crimes, was with an attitude of, in essence, I can do whatever I want. And that becomes important because in many of the ways that Mr. Durst committed the crimes, he was not very careful. And there's going to be evidence that you're going to hear where you're likely to be questioning, well, why would Mr. Durst have said that? Why would he have given this alibi witness? And that is what the purpose of this evidence is showing. So I want to be clear. In no way are we in any way arguing that because Mr. Durst had this attitude that he was predisposed to crime. He wasn't. All right, the Durst split their time between a penthouse at 37 Riverside Drive, which is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at 12 East 86th Street. The evidence will show that when Kathie ends up going to medical school, the East 86th Street is much closer to Jacobi Hospital in the Bronx. They also end up purchasing a weekend lakeside cottage, which is an hour away in South Salem, which is in Westchester County, New York. So it's basically a lot of people live, they work in the city, and Westchester County is a beautiful area where people will buy houses and they'll commute in. So that's where they were living at the time. Now, from the beginning, the relationship between Bob and Kathie was unequal. Defendant was older, he was more experienced, he was more educated, he was wealthier. And he was also, the evidence is going to show, unfaithful from the start. During the marriage, Mr. Durst had a series of affairs with other women. Later on in the marriage, Kathie is also going to be unfaithful. Mr. Durst was confronted with a system that he had for what he would do when he would date other women. And in essence, what the evidence will show is that Mr. Durst would take Polaroid photographs of anything in their place that connected to Kathie. He would then take that stuff down and he would entertain women so that they would not know he was married. Now, Mr. Durst is going to be confronted about that by Mr. Dreck in the next slide. And as you watch, Mr. Durst is going to, without shame, admit to the whole thing.
And what was the logic behind the Polaroids?
Just that I wanted this lady who I wanted to do not to know I was married.
Now, the evidence will also show that Mr. Durst strongly believed, and again, we've all known people who believe this way, that in essence, it was a double standard. He could cheat, but Kathie better not. But again, unlike most people, when Mr. Durst was confronted about it, instead of denying it or diverting, he voluntarily admits, that's my view.
Would you have been jealous if you knew that she was having an affair?
I'm sure I would have.
So was it you were proudly the bearer of the double standard that we all
Absolutely.
appreciate?
It didn't bother me at all. I honestly, I never voiced it like that or thought it through like that, but the way I felt was I feel like having sex with somebody else, it's all right, but boy, you better not.
Now, from the beginning of the relationship, the defendant was very controlling of Kathie.
Well, I was always very controlling.
Now, he discussed an example of this controlling behavior, again, with Mr. Dreck and Mr. Smerling during the 2011 interview.
And I think that she, at one point, I heard something about that you would ask Kathie to go to the social services office and pick up more food stamps, and she was very upset about that because she thought that was not right, or...
Yeah, I remember the food stamps thing. She thought we shouldn't be doing it.
And tell me, what do you remember about that? Or if there was
She
an
didn't
argument?
think we should be using food stamps when there's so little money available for the low-income programs. We don't need food stamps. Why are you doing it? And I think she felt embarrassed the supermarket with our food stamps.
Now, the importance of this evidence and what it's going to demonstrate is that over time, and given the difference in the power dynamic in the relationship, that he controlled her. And he got her to do things that she wouldn't have done. And over time, this conduct only escalated. In 1976, Kathie discovered that she was pregnant. This was Mr. Durst's reaction to her pregnancy. And again, these are his words, not mine.
Yes, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman. Given our discussion in the absence of the jury, this is character. This is an attempt to make him look bad.
So,
You know, I've been very clear and you
no, that's my concern isn't about, so if you hear evidence of, some of this is obviously negative about Mr. Durst's character, and ordinarily character is not relevant to prove any predisposition to commit crime. There is, at some point I'll give you instructions about domestic violence situations where the rule is slightly different. We'll talk about that at the appropriate time. As far as whether this is an argument, I think to some extent Mr. Lillimus is drawing some conclusions from facts, and when you infer, inference is the essence of argument, and so I will sustain the objection and allow you to continue.
Thank you, Ron.
And how do you remember her letting you know that she was pregnant? How did you find out?
She called me. She'd thrown up a couple of mornings, and she said she was going to see the doctor, and she called me during the day and said, I'm pregnant, and I want to keep this baby. And I said, I'm coming home. And I left the office and went back there, And we had a confrontation. I said, I told you from the beginning I didn't want children. There's no secrets. You agreed that we wouldn't have children. Now you're telling me you're pregnant, which, you know, you're in charge of that stuff, not me. And you want to keep the baby. Well, you keep the baby, you're going to get divorced from me. Period.
During the 2015 interview, Mr. Durst further explained how the abortion changed the relationship. And the evidence will show that that was the beginning of the escalation of the domestic violence in the marriage.
By the time Kathie disappeared, you didn't feel the same way about her that you did before, right? I mean...
Oh, no. I mean, Gilberta has it right in her quote when she first met us. We were in love.
Right.
Period. No two ways about it. We were in love. That lasted about 2 years.
Right.
And then we had the thing with the abortion.
Right.
And that was the end of it.
Now, the evidence will show that Mr. Durst also sought to control Kathie with his money.
I would give Kathie a small budget. This is what you got for the week or month or whatever it is. If you want to spend more, don't talk to me about it.
But did she have any other source of income?
No.
So whatever she gave her was the
That was it. Like we're getting an abortion, we're getting an abortion. This is how much money you've got to spend this week or month, period.
Now, what was happening at this time? This is now, we're in the late 70s, around 1970 and 1980. What was going on in Susan's life at the time? So, after graduating from UCLA, Susan moved to the Bay Area to pursue a master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley. After she graduated, she entered the professional world and became a successful journalist, writing for the San Francisco Examiner and for City Magazine. The evidence is going to show that Susan was somebody who had a very successful group of friends, female friends, and that early on, Susan kind of hit her stride much more quickly than they did. So she was kind of the star of her peer group. And what the evidence is going to show is that over time, Susan's life petered out and went downhill, whereas many of her friends became immensely successful. Now, one of the articles she wrote was on an aspiring musician named Nick Chavin. That is going to be the same Nick Chavin that is going to become a very close friend of Mr. Durst, and he's going to end up playing a very significant role in this case. Now, Susan and Nick would go on to become lifelong friends. Now, Susan eventually left the Bay Area for New York City, and where she continued to enjoy a lot of success writing, and among other periodicals, for the New Yorker. Chavin himself also later moved to New York City after divorcing his wife. And as a musician, he needed a day job. And the day job he ended up getting was as a copywriter for an advertising firm. Chavin and his separated wife sent their young daughter, Brandy, to live with Nick in New York City. Because Susan was still traveling back to San Francisco for work, Nick asked her if she would basically accompany Brandy back from San Francisco to New York. And Nick Chavin, when he testifies, is going to tell you that really cemented their relationship because of how kind Susan was to his daughter. Once in New York, Susan introduced Chavin to her very close personal friend, Bob Durst, or Bobby as she called him. The three would become very, very close, to some degree almost inseparable. Now, the defendant at the time was working for his father. And his father has one of the largest real estate conglomerates in all of New York City. And Nick Chavin sells advertising. So basically, Nick starts this job, and immediately Bob Durst sets him up with this giant account. So Nick is kind of like this very low-level guy, you know, like imagine the evidence. So imagine if you had gone to work at an ad agency, and you're right out of, new to the job, and then your first account is, hey, I can bring in Procter & Gamble. So it was a big deal to Nick. And Nick is going to describe to you, excuse me, how, in essence, he believes that he owes all of his success to Bob Durst. That's going to end up being a significant issue in this case, because the evidence is going to demonstrate that Nick Chavin, once he has very damaging information, is going to end up being heavily conflicted and does not want to turn on his friend.
I was doing advertising at an agency, I was a copywriter, and Bob called me one day and said, we have this new building we're building, 1155 Avenue of the Americas. You want to do the advertising for it? Now, this is an utterly strange question to ask a newbie in advertising if he would want to take control of a big account coming into an agency, the largest one at the agency.
And in getting this account, if I were to ask you, how instrumental was that in accelerating your career, what would be your response?
It was 100% responsible until I began to get other accounts because I had the Durst account. All I had to do was walk in somewhere and say, yes, I have the Durst organization account. I would get other accounts, which I wouldn't have gotten if I didn't have the Durst account.
So meanwhile, as the Durst marriage was headed downhill after the abortion, Kathie shifted her efforts to becoming a nurse. After graduation, she made the decision to apply to medical school, and in 1978, she was accepted by the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City. During the 2011 DVD commentary, Bob Durst discusses Kathie's desire to become a doctor in what you'll hear is a very demeaning fashion, and which again will be evidence of the nature of the relationship.
Now, eventually, she did apply to medical school. Did you know that she was applying to medical school when she did?
Sure. Encouraged her to do so, but with a big caveat that the people who go to medical school get real good grades, do real good on the MCATs. They mostly come from much better colleges than you went to. You want to do it. She applied to 15 of them and got interviewed and accepted.
On the screen is a movie that's make-believe. This is improper.
The court has already admitted the all good things to be shown to the jury. I would ask Mr. DeGuerin to object to things that have not already been litigated in the middle of my opening.
Well, I ask that they not cherry pick from hours and hours and hours of interviews.
You present what you want to present, and I'll present what I want to present.
Will the court instruct Mr. Lewin that he's not supposed to direct his comments to other counsel?
I believe Mr. DeGuerin just directed a comment to me, Your Honor. It needs to go both ways.
Okay,
No.
stop. Breathe. Okay, please be seated, Mr. DeGuerin. I've heard your objections, and the objection is overruled. You, again, there is, ladies and gentlemen, some evidence is admitted for a limited purpose. Here you'll understand the reason for the admission of this film. It's a fictional work, obviously, but at the time it's shown to you, the significance of that film and Mr. Durst's reaction to the film will be explained to you. So you were to consider, not to consider the film itself, which is a dramatic effort, as evidence, rather it will be admitted for a different purpose, which I'll explain at the time when that takes place. Here, for the record, we do have Mr. Durst commenting. This is evidence that Mr. Lewin expects to present, and that is evidence of Mr. Durst commenting upon the motion picture simultaneous with its projection. And our court reporter is not actually transcribing the text of this. She's not transcribing the sound because it's an exhibit that you will have during the trial. So I'm describing for our record what's taking place, and what Mr. Lewin is presenting to the jury now is a preview of what he expects the evidence will show. With that, you may continue, Mr. Lewin.
And just so it's clear, when you see the split screen like this, the DVD commentary, what we've done is we have made it so that you can see what Mr. Durst was seeing at the time that he was commenting. So when you're seeing, so on the right would be what he's watching as he's making the statement. So had you bought the DVD commentary, you wouldn't have seen what he was seeing. You would have only heard him talking, and that may or may not have been edited. So, as I was saying, let me start this slide again.
Now, eventually, she did apply to medical school. Did you know that she was applying to medical school when she did?
Sure. Encouraged her to do so, but with a big caveat that the people who go to medical school get real good grades, do real good on the MCATs. They mostly come from much better colleges than you went to. You want to do it. She applied to 15 of them and got interviewed and accepted at Albert Einstein. None of the others were interested.
Now, as Kathie became more independent, graduated nursing school, started medical school, started having success in her life, independent of Bob Durst, he began to lose control. You're going to hear from Jimmy McCormack, who is Kathie's older brother, and he's going to testify about his observations of the relationship.
You know, those years were, I think, years where Kathie started to migrate not just away from Bob, but above Bob. Because he basically, from a career standpoint, seemed to plateau. You know, his aspirations and his desires to become something beyond what he'd already, reached, which was basically the son of a very rich man, didn't seem to blossom. And whether that was on his own initiative or whether it was a result of all of the other influences in his life, I can't, speak, too clearly on, but that Kathie was moving on. And I think he started to develop a resentment for her growing. She was becoming more of a woman, more of an adult, more of an accomplished professional. And when she had that doctor's degree, she would have been, basically self-sufficient, which was her dream.
Now, the defendant himself, again, addressed this issue during the 2011 interviews with Mr. Jarecki during the DVD commentary.
Was there a moment when you felt that her effort to kind of get out there and go to medical school and do those things went from being a good activity for her, career for her, and it started to be a distraction from her relationship with you?
I was always very controlling. In terms of the stuff that's out there, that I tried to get her out of medical school, and that I wouldn't pay her tuition. I wouldn't pay her tuition because she had hired lawyers. My lawyer had insisted I don't pay for anything I hadn't paid for me in the past, and she had gone and done one of those federal programs where they pay for it and you take a loan. The lawyer said, don't pay for the medical school.
So the evidence is going to show that, in essence, Bob Durst cut her off financially, and Kathie was forced to take out loans to go to school, to pay rent.
Mr. Lewin, it's coming up on the noon hour time.
Oh, this is good time, Your Honor, absolutely.
So, ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among